Well, ladies and gentlemen, and my dear friends, today I propose to deliberate the contemporary issues, international refugee law, and new developments and challenges to the protection of refugees and forced migrants. And we have to further understand the perspectives on the future of refugees on this beautiful planet called Earth. My dear friends, this is a very, very important engagement because this takes into account the current scenario of refugee crisis. If you try to understand the entire canvas of human migration, human mobility, and other important dimensions, then you will come to know the entire geopolitical map of the world is telling a different kind of a story, and that too in the beginning of the third decade of the 21st century. My dear friends, in present day world, we find that no continent is free from any kind of a refugee movement. We have been witnessing international migration, internally displaced persons, forced migrants, economic migration, and that results, my dear friends, whatever may be the nomenclature, whatever may be the attributions, whatever may be the ramifications and implications of this kind of a human mobility, but the net outcome that remains same, and that is the human suffering and human misery. Dear friends, current world geopolitical trajectory unprecedentedly has been ignoring the centrality of the human rights of refugees, asylum seekers, migrants, and stateless people. And they have established the tentacles of their multi-dimensional sovereignty as a reaction to present day challenges and global crises like the refugee migration crisis, socio-economic inequalities, climate change disasters, racism, ultra-neo-nationalism, nuclear apartheid, and threats to data protection. These issues can only be exposed, my dear friends. These issues can only be confronted through an interdisciplinary discourse and an applied approach to human rights. Next to historical, political, philosophical, and legal dimensions, the perspectives of international human rights law, international refugee law, international humanitarian law, and culture of constitutionalism in understanding and addressing contemporary refugee crisis, that really gives us an opportunity in these extraordinary circumstances of human crisis. My dear friends, in my personal understanding, if you put a question to me, what exactly is my observation or would my observation be, then I am of the view that the world has been morphing, transforming, and transiting in desire and discourse, grace and guidance, purpose and practicality, pace and propensity, and terrorism and transcendentalism alike. Dear friends, but this transformation does not address the biggest contemporary challenges posed to international refugee law in its present positioning. The national governments across the globe have given the cold shoulder to refugees in their itinerary of international obligations and duties, as enunciated, my dear friends, in the United Nations Charter on Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But we should not forget other vast pool of human rights instruments. However, international community has been performing its refugee mandate in an ostensible manner that is insufficient and contemptuous to their basic rights and dignity. My dear friends, today, refugees have been grappling with scorn, suspicion, disdain, and skepticism of national governments in their quest for durable solutions to human displacement and migration. But unfortunately, refugees are being squeezed in the state practices which are reflected in their autonomy of sovereignty. Foreign policy, or rather I should say the foreign policy predilections, international relations control, and geostrategic choices that undermine the dignity, equality, and liberty of the refugees in the long run. My dear friends, with this background, I am having two important issues which I have selected relating to refugees. It does not mean that other issues are not important. I would definitely be emailing you the rest of the issues. But if you take into account the present day reality of refugees, then there are certain important refugee crises. A very protracted refugee crisis is of Palestinian refugees. Then the Syrian refugees, and thereafter Rohingya refugees, and now we are having Ukrainian refugee crisis. But for our understanding, I am going to take up first the Ukrainian refugees, and thereafter I would be addressing Syrian refugees. And there, from South Asia, in that very week, which is exclusively devoted to the SAARC region, significantly we have also deliberated Rohingya refugees and what exactly has been the attitude of the national governments towards Rohingya refugees, and that too in an era of post-global compacts on refugees and migrants. Therefore, today I propose, my dear friends, at this stage, the Ukrainian refugee crisis. My dear friends, if you take into account the current figures of Ukrainian refugee crisis, today is the 19th of April, 2022. If you collect present day data, you will find that almost 5 million refugees have already left Ukraine in the month of what you call yesterday, in this month of April 2022, while an estimated, my dear friends, more than 7 million people have been displaced within the country of Ukraine. And they should be, branded, they should be categorized as internally displaced persons. So that is the, situation. Or in other words, let me put it like this, that more than 11 million people are already there who have already been, uprooted from their habitual places of residence. This is the, very zigzag kind of, That is a very rough kind of estimation that has been provided by the United Nations. My dear friends, this number could ultimately grow further, and international community is making preparations to meet their humanitarian needs. But the needs which are being extended to Ukrainian refugees are still insufficient. My dear friends, just hours after Russia's assault began, there were massive traffic jams, sold out train tickets, and long lines at ATMs in the capital city of Ukraine, as people try to flee with little clue as to how long they might be gone, or if they will ever be what you call having any kind of option to return to their country of origin. There is a significant movement of population. But this is equally important, my dear friends, to understand whether people are moving permanently or for the short term. Because if you take into account Article 15 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that really gives a right to live and right to return. And cumulatively, we should try to understand Article 13, Article 14, Article 15 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But, my dear friends, for now, Central Europe has been receiving Ukrainians with a large heart. At the same time, my dear friends, reception countries, particularly the neighboring countries like Poland, which is planning to accommodate up to 1 million Ukrainians, as well as Romania, Hungary, Slovakia, and Moldova, where already we find more than 5,000 Ukrainians arrived during this particular short period. But those couldn't or those particularly those countries who are not currently equipped to handle the volume of refugees or refugee exodus that are likely to arrive on their borders in the coming weeks, and Europeans and US leadership need to scramble for any kind of humanitarian help build up, and they have to meet the capacity how they are going to treat these new arrivals of refugees. My dear friends, the primary receiving countries in Central Europe simply don't have the capacity to meet those very needs, and that too on a very large scale, and that too on a very prolonged basis. For example, I can say that the Poland only accepted about more than 5,000 refugees at the initial stage. But amount of resources which is likely to be dedicated, my dear friends, may not be sufficient to the full scope and scale of this new refugee crisis at the doors of Europe. Therefore, Ukrainian needs go beyond temporary provisions of food, clothing, shelter, healthcare that can sustain them through the cold weather. So this is the crisis of of many or multiple dimensions. My dear friends, Ukrainians have been facing ever since attack on Ukraine started. They have been facing the prospects of the long-term displacement. And that means they need formal pathways to legal status, access to resettlement services. They require permanent housing options, right to education, right to health care, and many other important fundamental rights, including vaccination for COVID-19 global pandemic, which has ravaged Ukraine in recent months. Therefore, European Union, particularly the European Union states or the member states of the European Union, and they are as many as 27 nation states will likely bear the brunt of any kind of a potential, what we call, influx of the Ukrainian refugees at their back doors. That will also require, my dear friends, a lot of money and infrastructure that aid organizations cannot provide in its totality. But there is a role, my dear friends, for bigger what we call military powers, like United States of America. United States of America can provide even more financial support and humanitarian aid that it has already and also provided. It has been helping. I mean, the United States of America has been what we call extending all kinds of help to ensure that the Ukrainians have a place to go. United States of America, my dear friends, can help coordinate resettlement so as no one country has to bear the entire what we call burden sharing what we call project. So for the resettlement or humanitarian what we call aid is concerned to Ukrainian refugees. In this particular scenario, we can say that Europe has been bracing what could be the biggest refugee crisis since 2015. Because from April 2011 up to 2015, European nation states were confronted with the Syrian refugee crisis, when more than 1 million migrants and refugees arrived on European continent. This reminds me of a very, very important statement of the President of the European Union Commission, Ursula. She was of the view that the European Union has been preparing to welcome and host Ukrainian refugees, and that too with the coordination with the frontline member states like Slovakia, Moldova, Poland, and other important frontline states. Ursula further what we call was of the view that the European Union Commission has to coordinate with the European civil protection and humanitarian aid operations. That is the EU's humanitarian arm, and that is ready to provide for the basic and the immediate needs for internally displaced Ukrainites, I should say. And the European Union will also accelerate its financial assistance for refugees beyond what they have already promised, almost 1.5 billion, if I am not wrong, or less than that, a little bit less than that, as a humanitarian aid that is already available to what we call Ukrainian refugees. But the exact amount has not been determined so far. So far, Ukraine's western neighbors have pledged to take in refugees, particularly refugees fleeing Russia's attack. My dear friends, Ukrainians began showing up on their borders by the thousands, and there appears to many more on the way, given the crowded roadways, railways, flights, all kinds of modes of transports are flooded with Ukrainian refugees. I can give you example of Poland, the largest country on Ukraine's western flank or the western what you call border, and that is expected to be the primary destination for refugees. My dear friends, as of now, if you take into account, there are as many as 8 important reception points have been designated along every rather border crossing where they can get food, medical what you call assistance, right to information, whatever the information is available, and there is a transport available to more than 8 points from those sites to other regions of the what we call of Poland, if they are really to migrate from Poland to other what we call nation states within the European peninsula. It is important, my dear friends, even the Polish or the internal affairs minister from Poland or of Poland rightly what we call pointed out that we are here to ensure the national security, but also ensure the best conditions for Ukrainian what we call citizens. Government of Poland was of the view that we have to create some kind of a coordination between national security and the rights of what we call of refugees, and there has to be some kind of a balance between the two important forces. The kind of mobilization which we have been witnessing, my dear friends, across Europe to come to the Ukrainians area stands in contrast to past responses to migrant crisis. Just months ago, Poland decided to utilize the troops and construct, my dear friends, if $400 million wall to repel predominantly Muslim asylum seeker at its border with Belarus. But they wanted to avoid Muslim, what we call, refugees. And now they are welcoming wholeheartedly Ukrainian refugees because they identify themselves with Ukrainians on the basis of race, on the basis of religion, on the basis of ethnicity, because they identify with them. Over the past few years, my dear friends, Hungary has passed laws criminalizing support for asylum seekers and limiting the right to asylum, and has also allowed police to automatically expel any unauthorized migrants. If you take into account, my dear friends, 2015, the influx of the Syrian refugees fueled the rise of what we call populist, anti-immigration, Eurosceptic, I should say, and far-right parties across Europe. But if you see the role of these political outfits in the Ukrainian refugee crisis, you are going to be surprised. Why is this time any different? EU countries might be more open to absorbing Ukrainians fleeing the wrath of their what we call adversary. But there might also be more willingness to accept the Ukrainians because they are white. As I have already pointed out, and yesterday also I have pointed out, Europeans, and majority of them happens to be of Christians, revealing the troubling rise of the nationalist movements rooted in fear of what we call of others. That is the what we call argument, and that is the most important, rather I should say, instrumental argument, I should say. And this instrumental argument has further what we call embedded, and that what we call deriving its validity, legitimacy from racism, from Christianity, from this idea of supremacy of white or white supremacy. But having said, having deliberated all these dimensions, not only Europe has been supporting Ukrainian refugees without any kind of a law, or the laws which have been passed by Hungary and other nation states just to control and manage the Syrian refugees or the immigration of Muslims to Europe. Now, these legislations, laws, state practices have been relegated to the background. And not only the Europe, but even the United States of America has started supporting Ukrainian refugees. Because it is the geography, my dear friends, that dictates that the Central Europe will likely to be the epicenter of the Ukrainian refugee crisis, but the US still has a role to play. And it is playing, and it might play its role because of these considerations which I have already submitted, like racism, like white supremacy, while ethnicity, cultural affinity. Because of these what we call considerations, United States of America is equally comfortable to support Ukrainian refugees. Therefore, my dear friends, the responsibility to support refugees and asylum seekers in Europe cannot fall squarely or exclusively on Europeans. This is the argument. Even the European political leadership, multiple political leadership has been making, and that is why they have been eliciting the support of the United States of America, because the US constantly talks about the need to show solidarity in various what we call disciplines. And it is one of the most important discipline, and that is the humanitarian crisis of European origin. And therefore, there is a need for solidarity in support of what we call Ukrainian asylum seekers. So that is the argument which is generally advanced by the political what we call establishment across the Europe in support of Ukrainian refugees. My dear friends, many of the 6,000 armed forces deployed to Poland have already been helping set up processing what we call units. But some migration experts in Poland are of the view, and they have also raised an anxieties that the Poland has nowhere near the capacity to accommodate 1 billion refugees as it has initially targeted or submitted or promised. As of or in the fact end of the month of March, if I am correct in my submissions, the capacity to accommodate 1 billion refugees has been questioned by various experts in Poland. There were only 2,000 spots for refugee across all the centers, all the units which have been established and operated by the government's office of foreigners in Poland. Therefore, the Polish border security forces had room only for 1,000 people. Though the authorities were of the view that they would be able to make additional what we call units or additional what we call accommodation for accommodating and adjusting Ukrainian refugees. But at the same time, my dear friends, they have to rely on international funds and at the same time personnel to make those extensions what we call to be realized. In United States of America, a State Department spokesperson in the second week of April opined that the US has been coordinating with the government of Ukraine, European what we call allies, international organizations, and non-governmental organizations on contingency planning and preparedness efforts. It was engaging diplomatically to ensure neighboring countries keep their borders open to those seeking international protection. And it was actively and proactively, rather I should say, planning to augment ongoing US humanitarian support in Ukraine, and that too in response to the Russian what we call aggression. This is the line of argument that has been shared by the spokespersons of the Joe Biden administration in the second week of April. My dear friends, United Nations Refugee Agency, and that is the UNHCR, For a very long time, this UN agency, that is the UNSCR, is present and actively performing its duties in Ukraine. It has also asked international community for more than what you call the 200 million in humanitarian assistance. That is a request, my dear friend, that hadn't yet been answered if you take into account the latest what you call deadline of yesterday. Because this is the help which is being requested by the United Nations High Commission for Refugees to meet the needs of an estimated 1.8 million people, nearly half of which are children or elderly. This has also been what you call there in public domain. At the same time, my dear friends, the US Congress could also work to pass an emergency supplemental bill that would provide further resources for US embassies in affected countries. That would increase the effectiveness of the reallocation pipelines and provide further assistance to Ukrainians and other impactees, I should say, in individual and collective capacities in this particular region of Europe that dominates what you call Ukraine and its neighboring nation states. My dear friends, the United States of America and its government has also impressed upon Putin that Putin should further open the doors of diplomacy. That is another important what you call argument. Because there is an urgent requirement to negotiate for a humanitarian corridor that would allow people who want to leave Ukraine and to do so safely, and for humanitarian what you call groups to continue to operate in Ukraine, sense any kind of fear, any kind of intimidation of reprisals, or any kind of harm or any kind of action. Therefore, it is the responsibility of the Russian government to create circumstances so that we may have some kind of humanitarian corridor to save the lives of women, save the lives of particularly of children. This is the current scenario so far Ukrainian refugee crisis is concerned. My dear friends, we have been witnessing a new kind of approach on the part of the United States of America. So far, arrival reception of Ukrainian refugees is concerned in United States of America. Because if the humanitarian corridors are opened, or whatever may be the number of the current Ukrainian refugees who arrived in United States of America, Joe Biden administration immediately and unilaterally increased the number of what we call of accommodation centers allocated to Europeans under the US refugee admission program. I have also talked of this program yesterday. If you take into account, my dear friends, the current numbers that is kept at 10,000 for the current fiscal year, and as of January, what we call 31st this year, my dear friends, 335 of those what we call spots had already been filled in the United States of America, and mostly by the Ukrainian refugees. But it cannot take days or months or even years to come to the US as a refugee, which might be too long for Ukrainians if you take into account the entire refugee crisis of Ukraine. My dear friends, the capacity of the United States of America refugee program, particularly the refugee program that is operated by the United States of America abroad, continues to be limited due to pandemic, due to the what we call pandemic, global pandemic induced shutdowns and lockdowns, and the cutbacks and whatever the cuts which have been what we call carried out by the Joe Biden's predecessors, and that is the Donald Trump administration. So that has also, cleared the pitch for the humanitarian considerations and humanitarian aid. But Biden could also provide a temporary protected status or the temporary protection status, TPS, which I have highlighted very lucidly yesterday to Ukrainian refugees who have already arrived in the United States of America, which would temporarily shield them from any kind of an expulsion, any kind of a repatriation or the forced repatriation or any kind of a deportation, and allow them to work legally and reside legally in United States of America. That kind of a status is typically offered to citizens of the countries suffering from armed conflicts like Russia's invasion of Ukraine. My dear friends, if you take into account the current status of Ukrainians in the United States of America, you will find that there are as many as more than 30,000 Ukrainian refugees already living in the United States of America who do not have any American citizenship or other kinds of permanent residential status. That is the situation of the Ukrainians. It is because of what we call United States of America and its people identify themselves with the complexion, race, and other considerations with that of Ukrainians. This is the what you call situations. So you can very well understand. And further, my dear friends, Biden can also allow Ukrainians to come to the US on humanitarian parole, which allows what you call populations facing urgent humanitarian need to enter and stay in the United States or United States of America without any kind of a visa. The benefit of parole, therefore, is that it can be approved within a matter of days or hours, as opposed to the many months or years it typically takes to process a visa. It is the same mechanism, my dear friends, that allowed tens of thousands of Afghans to come to the US following the American withdrawal last year. That should not be forgotten. Because the airports, if you take into account the Ukrainian situations on the same footing, airports in Ukraine are now closed or destroyed by Russia, and Biden has said that his administration will not carry out any kind of evacuation from Ukraine, as it is not clear if any significant number of Ukrainians would be able to reach the US, even if any of those immigration pathways were available to them. That really a very, very strange situation, and that was necessitated by the Russian Federation's what we call armed conflict, or sponsored what rather imposed armed conflict, I should say, upon Ukraine. Because what is important, whether we are deliberating, my dear friends, any kind of political ramifications, diplomatic implications, geostrategic predilections, or the membership or expansionizations of the military alliances like NATO, and drafting or proposed drafting of Ukraine in this particular military alliance, whatever may be our arguments, but at the end of the day, it is the human suffering, it is the human misery that is important, and that must not be what we call appreciated on the basis of ethnicity, on the basis of race, on the basis of religion, on the basis of political opinion, on the basis of membership of a particular social group. Under all circumstances, human suffering is human suffering, and therefore we have to ponder over above all these considerations. Then only, if we claim ourselves to be a human being, so our humanity should not be at loggerheads with the humanity of other people. So now I switch over to another important refugee crisis, and that is a refugee crisis posed by the Syrian refugees. Any questions as of now?
Sir, I have a question.
Yeah, please.
Sir, it's not connected to this refugee crisis, although it's connected to Russia-Ukraine crisis. So what I was reading in the news that during this World Cup qualifier, the FIFA World Cup qualifier, this Russia-Ukraine crisis started, and FIFA revoked FIFA disqualified Russia from participating in the qualifiers to which they were entitled to. And the reason FIFA gave to Russian Football Federation, was that since they attacked Ukraine, and due to this crisis, we are suspending the Russian football team. So, sir, is this a right way to suspend a football team? Just because a national football team, just because a crisis occurred?
My dear friend, your question is legitimate, but while asking question, it is equally important to take into account other important implications. We have to understand, my dear friends, international law on sanctions. There cannot be any kind of a selective sanctions, because under international law, and that too relating to the use of force, international law is very clear. There is no ambiguity. We have to understand the preambular propositions which have been encapsulated in the schematizations of the United Nations Charter. We have to understand the mandate of the Chapter 6 and Chapter 7, Chapter 5, Article 51, Article 55, Article 57, recommendations of the International Law Commission, we have to understand further the mandate of the United Nations Human Rights Council. We have to take into account the treaty obligations envisioned in the 9 core international human rights treaties. If we take into account, my dear friends, the peaceful settlement of international dispute, because the use of force should be understood as a last resort. Even if we are going to prefer the coercive settlement of international dispute proposition, when we are undertaking all these dimensions cumulatively, then we are going to have an understanding that the Russian attack on Ukraine is really an armed attack. An armed attack of an international, what he call character. It is not a non-international character. It doesn't have a non-international character. For all practical reasons, for all understandings, whatever may be the propositions which have been advocated over the years by a pool of scholarships, Russian Federation's attack cannot be qualified as a military campaign. It is an attack against the sovereignty, political independence, territorial integrity, and geopolitical identity of the Republic of Ukraine. It becomes immaterial what has been the history of Ukraine, how it has been honest in the past, what kind of an impact it has experienced in the wake of Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. But once it has declared itself independent in 1991, after the disintegration of the Russian or Soviet Union, 50 new republics, emerged, and it is one of them. So it is the question of the sovereignty, it is the question of the political independence of Ukraine. I cannot buy any other argument as a student of international law. Because not only the law is important, but at the same time, the international law morality is equally important to defend the territorial integrity and the political independence of the Republic of Ukraine. And it is a violation of some of the fundamental principles which have also been appreciated under the Charter of the League of Nations and the Havana Convention and Montevideo Conventions of the 1933 and 1928. So cumulatively speaking, my dear friends, it is not a question that on one side it is the military establishment, a military alliance of more than 30 nations, which is today known as North Atlantic Treaty Organizations, NATO. And on the other side, it is one nation state, and that is Russian Federation. No, we have to, look beyond this, what we call binary. If on the basis of the holistic approach, I am of the view that it has been a unilateral military, what we call, misadventure on the part of Russian Federation that ultimately resulted in the sufferings of people. We can definitely, what we call, critically appreciate or make a presentation of our critique, what has been the role of the, global North jurisdictions when there is a question of what we call of the, refugees emanating from the developing nation states. And that we have been, if we are, undertaking some kind of a, comparison, just to highlight the points, just to cajole the double standards of the global North jurisdictions, how they have been, treating the, identical circumstances, identical humanitarian crisis. But my dear friends, that does not, what we call, mitigate the sufferings of the Ukrainian people or Rohingya people or Russian, what we call, refugees in the past, or the refugees from Syria, refugees or the, Roma minorities. Human sufferings remain same. So that is my understanding, my dear friends, that if some nation states are of the view that the Russian Federation should be suspended, and they have suspended from the FIFA World Cup, they have taken an action this is a action, a half-backed action, I should say. And that does not entail any kind of a economic crisis upon Russia or in Russia. They wanted to send a message to ordinary Russians that if your political leadership is indulging in this kind of military campaigns or unilateral military actions against an independent sovereign nation state, and as a civilized member of the community of nation states under United Nations organizations, then such actions are warranted. That is the only, otherwise we know, you are already well acquainted that many of the European nation states are still buying Russian oil, Russian energy, Russian gas. They haven't stopped. And this is a kind of a tacit understanding on economic front. Because, my dear friends, we should not forget, we cannot survive alone. If Indians are of the view, if Pakistanis are of the view that we can survive in this world without any kind of external help, no, it's a misconception. Whatever may be the threshold of our nationalism, whatever may be the nationalistic egoism we have been espousing, even then we cannot survive alone in this globalized world. What is important is that we have been surviving in a globalized world, but at the same time, we have to put a question to ourselves, and that is, are we surviving in a constitutionalized world? That is the question. This is the question which is available to South Asians, and it is equally available to the Russian people and the political leaderships of all the geopolitical entities. Therefore, some cosmetic sanctions are undertaken by those very countries who are controlling international legal institutional structures at international level, and United States of America is one of them. But in case of the Gulf War, in case of Vietnam War, in case of the second Gulf War, in case of what we call the Afghanistan misadventure, Russian Federation did not bother to question the actions of NATO and actions of the what we call the international corp, and that is the United States of America. Because Russian Federation already what we call dismantled the Warsaw Pact, what we call nations. That was also a military establishment, a military alliance to counter what we call NATO military alliance. So we are basically living, militarily speaking, in a world of unilateralism. But at the same time, my dear friends, when the actions of United States of America and its allies are there in public domain, nobody questions. Otherwise, I don't see any kind of a difference. So far, the violations of the territorial integrity is concerned of any particular nation state, and in this case, it is the Ukraine. These kinds of actions have already been, there on the part of the United States of America. United States of America in the past has violated the territorial integrity of many what we call nation states, including Congo, Rwanda, Liberia, in South Asia, even in Pakistan, Afghanistan, in Middle East and Far East. What kind of an action has been there? Who is responsible for the establishment of the state of Israel? Because I don't want to go into the nitty-gritty of details. It is going, otherwise it is going to be an inconclusive deliberation. Who have massacred Jews? Who is paying the price of their what we call pogrom or Holocaust? The state of Palestine has been there, but it has been decimated. Nobody is bothering about the Palestinian refugees. And now the United States of America is coming out for Ukrainian refugees. I support if United States of America is supporting Ukrainian refugees. Being a student of international refugee law, this is my responsibility, my duty, that I should think of refugees. But there should not be discriminatory practices, and that too on the part of those very nation states who are capable of helping refugees. For the last more than what we call 70 years, my dear friends, nothing concrete has been thought of or thought about Palestinian refugees. Who has created ISIS? Who has been supplying arms? It's an open secret. It is in public domain. So whether these nation states are suspending, because whether it is the question of the Bretton Woods institutions, whether it is the question of what we call the military alliances, whether it is the question of the world economy who is controlling, whether it is a question of the internet or the data, what we call protection, who is controlling, everything is in the heads of what we call of these United States of America and its allies. They have been controlling the resources of entire what we call world. They have been controlling and dictating the economies, the national economies of various nation states. That is why they can suspend, they can impose, but they have adopted a selective approach, and that is the bone of contention. Any other question? Or would you like to supplement with your arguments? If you have some inputs, you can supplement.
Sir, I have a question. Sir, when we look at the history of India, we see that India has given refugee to so many communities. If I start from the Parsi community, which is based in Bombay, Gujarat, and some part of Sindh, so they were also given refuge inside the territory. Then, sir, we talk. Then we talk about the Tibetans. They were also given refuge under the shelter of Union of India. And there are many communities, sir, that have been given the status of refugee inside the Indian territory. But when it comes to other communities, just like, for example, Rohingya and other communities and Chakma community as well, who wanted to get refuge inside the territory of India, there were restrictions. And sir, apart from this, if when we apart from this, when we consider this history of India giving refuge to such certain communities, so, sir, why India has not signed the convention with regards to refugee law of 1951? Like, why it has not ratified, despite the fact that it despite the fact that in history it has given to certain communities the refuge.
So, may I add to this?
Yeah, please.
What I think is that why India is not part of that, like why we have not ratified, because there is always a conflict in terms of the West when they talk about how international law, as you must have noticed that how third world is still a critique. Scholarly work is a critique to the international law, saying that we only can contribute in the sense of critiquing it and not actually give out principles towards it. If I'm making sense, I'm so sorry, I'm a bit fuzzle brained today. But so the idea is that there are certain countries of the global south which do not approve of that line of argument. Also, the fact that it's there are certain, I think, if I'm not wrong, there are certain provisions which we do not conquer with in terms of the refugee principles, because again the ideologies are very different. um, yeah, that's pretty much it. I think it's the matter of I'm so sorry, I'm not able to articulate it well, but I
Well,
had read
it's
an
all
article.
right. You have very beautifully, agitated me. So thank you very much, Ms. Sajul. I am immensely grateful. My dear friends, Mr. Om Jha, it is a question I have been time and again facing. And it is the vital question. Because if you take an assessment of the entire scholarship from South Asia, Southeast Asia, or in other words, let me put it like this. If you undertake an assessment of the Afro-Asian scholarship on 1951 UN Convention relating to the status of refugees, you will find there are certain important common points. And these common points include, my dear friends, and this is the biggest allegation in the form of an argument that has been cited against the conclusion of 1951 UN Convention relating to the status of refugees. And that is that 1951 Refugee Convention is a Eurocentric convention. Why it is Eurocentric? because this is a convention which has been adopted under the auspices of the United Nations organizations immediately after the conclusion of the Second World War, when it has been pointed out by the European political leadership that there happens to be a lot of human mobility in the form of refugees from one European nation to another European nation within the Europe or within this European continent. So it has been realized that there has been intra-European migration of refugees, and that has been the result of the Second World War. So it has been realized and it has been thought by the political leadership that let us have a regional convention to address this intra-European migration of refugees, and how to handle it, how to regulate it, how to manage it, how to accommodate them. So under the auspices of the United Nations organizations on 28th of July in 2051, this regional convention was adopted and it was made applicable to European nation states. Today, and at that point of the time, Europe was consisting of 47 nation states. But in the subsequent years, it was again realized by the political leadership at international level that the refugee problem is not alone, or it is not confined to Europe alone. Rather, we have been witnessing refugees outside the European continent. Then an additional protocol in 1967 was adopted, which ultimately made 1951 Regional Convention universal one. This regional protocol was adopted to make 1951 Convention international, global, or universal. So this is how 1951 Convention today has become an international refugee protection instrument. And some of the provisions of this particular convention has also attained international customary law, implications. There are scholars like Professor Guy S. Goodwin, who also attribute customary international law character to this particular convention, like Professor Jane McAdam from Australia, like Madam Erika Feather, like late Professor Harold Bond. They have significantly attributed the customary international law implications of this 1951 Refugee Convention. Controversy starts. This brief background. Controversy starts at this stage. After the adoption of 1967 additional protocol, many of the nation states has refused to accede, particularly Afro-Asian nation states refused to accede to the mandate of 1951 convention because they were not satisfied, they were not comfortable with the definition clause of the 1951 convention. Because the Afro-Asian nation states were of the view, and it is also axiomatic if you read the Cartagena Declaration of 1984 and you also study 1969 OAU Convention relating to the specific aspects of refugees in Africa. If both at the same time the Bangkok Principles, if you study these instruments from the global South nation states, you will find that the scholarship from the global South jurisdictions were right, and they are right. Because the grounds which have been identified by the European scholarship or identified in this scheme of 1951 convention, they are as many as only 5 grounds. And these 5 grounds, my dear friends, do not fulfill the criteria as well as the grounds of human displacement and human migration in global South nation states. These grounds were only confined to the European nation states, and rest of the grounds, because the states who drafted this convention, 1951 convention, they have violated some of the important what we call notions, and these notions resulted in the ground. Suppose, and when this particular convention was passed, many of the nation states in Africa and Asia were not decolonized. They were still basking in the reflected glory of colonialism, and that is why African nations, Asian nations, majority of them opposed the mandate of 1951 convention, because these global South nation states were struggling, they were opposing, and they were grappling with foreign aggression, foreign occupation, foreign domination, generalized violence, massive violations of human rights, subordination, and they were what you call, striving for the decolonizations of their territories. And because of these grounds, they were also having intra-African migration, intra-Asian migration, and that is why, my dear friends, they were opposed. But after the completion of the decolonization cycle, and particularly after the adoption of 1969 OAU Convention relating to the specific aspects of refugees in Africa, many nation states have also started, and a new kind of a scholarship has also emerged at international level, like Professor what you call Matwa, Professor Angie, and other important scholars. And they were of the view that a new kind of understanding based on the argument of complementarity must be further encouraged and advocated. And therefore, it has been identified that the grounds and the mandate of the 1951 convention must also be read with 1969 OAU Convention on Refugees, while taking into considerations further the mandate of the Cartagena Declaration, though it is a soft law, but the mandate of the Cartagena Declaration of 1984, which is exclusively meant for the Latin American nation states, must also be taken into consideration. So cumulatively speaking, these three instruments should be put together, and thereafter we should try to what we call solve the refugee crisis at international level. If further, a complementarity pathway has also been provided in 2018 in the form of what we call the global compacts on refugees and migrants under the mandate of the 2016 New York Declaration on Refugees and Migrants. This has also resulted in 2004, my dear friends. In 2004, even the eminent persons groups, which I have already submitted for your consideration when we were deliberating the refugee protection in South Asia, even the nation states, after Colombo consultations, Dhaka consultations, and Delhi consultations, having many consultations, we have also adopted in South Asia a declaration that is known as South Asian Declaration on Migratory Movements in our part of the world, and that is the SAARC region. And this is the declaration of the 2004, which I have already emailed you. On the basis of this declaration, the eminent persons groups, as a part of the civil society organization, or as a submission on the part of the civil society organization, that has also come out with a model refugee law for the consideration of the South Asian nation states, and at the same time for the consideration to adopt a regional declaration, a regional what we call convention for the protection of refugees in South Asia. This model law that has been presented by the eminent persons group is nothing, my dear friends, but an amalgamation, a kind of a synthesis, a kind of a conflation, a kind of a amalgamation of 1951 and 1969, what we call European and African Convention respectively. So this is how this important document has been prepared, and that has ultimately impelled the scholars like Professor Matwa, Professor Engen, Professor B.S. Chimney, that they have to what we call change. Particularly, let me point out at this stage the contributions of Professor B.S. Chimney. After the conclusion of 1951 convention relating to the status of refugees in 1951, Professor Chimney persistently, I should say, opposed this convention for more than 35 or 40 years. But if you see his recent what he call position, he has also changed his position, and particularly after the conclusion of the Global Compact on refugees and migrants in 2018 on 19th of December in Marrakesh in Morocco. That ultimately materialized, that ultimately what he call realized the objectives, political objectives which have been set, humanitarian objectives as well as the political objectives which have been set under the leadership, active leadership with the active support of the Obama administration in 2016 in the form of the 2016 New York Declaration on Refugees and Migrants, which was the result of the political establishment of the United States of America on one side and the humanitarian establishment, and that is the civil society organizations, UNHCR, ECOSOC, UNESCO, and other important what we call organizations under the auspices of the United Nations organizations. So this is how we have adopted, and ultimately scholars like Professor B.S. Chimney, they have also changed, and now they are advocating the ratification of 1951 convention, and that too on the part of the South Asian what we call grouping or the SAARC alliance. It is also a fact, and it must be, let me put it on record, that in 2000, not 2000, but it was the year 93 up to what we call 1995. During these 3 years period or 2 years periods, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and India promised to international community of nation states that the years ahead we are going to put our seal and signature on 1951 UN Convention relating to the status of refugees with its additional protocol of 1967. But we are still what we call waiting for the approbation of these nation states, or approbation on the part of these nation states. So far their signatures are concerned on this international instrument. So this is the entire what we call story, because it was basically the two major one major contention has always been there, and it was the definition and the grounds which have been envisioned under the what we call this 1951 definition clause. Any other observation?
No,
Yes,
sir.
Ms. Sajal.
No, sir.
So let us switch over to Syrian refugee crisis. Dear friends, there are more than 7 million Syrians who have been what we call forced to flee. Particularly their country since 2011. This is a figure, my dear friends, which is confined and takes into account the data up to December 2020. But if you take further the current data, then it is 13.1 million refugees. But at the same time, my dear friends, there are another 6.2 million Syrians who have been driven from their homes but remain trapped inside the country or inside Syria as internally displaced people. My dear friends, the vast majority of the Syrian refugees, these Syrian refugees, majority of them have found safety in neighboring countries like Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon. And Turkey alone hosts more than what we call, almost 5 million Syrian refugees. And currently, this data, if you consult, you will find that it has been what we call, hosting around, 10 million refugees. My dear friends, approximately 9 lakh people have been, uprooted from their homes as per the latest, data, or rather I should say since 2019. And we also find that there is a, increase in the middle of, February 2020 of more than what we call, 1 lakh people in less than a week. My dear friends, almost 94% of the 6.7 million Syrian refugees who have fled neighboring countries live in urban settings. More than 60% of the Syrian refugees live in poverty with unemployment and uneven access to education and denial of other basic what we call or essential services. So they have been living in a state of misery, in a state of what we call of deprivation and denial of the basic what we call necessities to sustain what we call life. For example, the most impacted what we call segment of the refugee population or the Syrian refugee population happens to be, and that is of children. We find diseases and malnutrition. Children are susceptible to ailments brought on poor sanitation, including diarrhea, diseases like cholera. They have been missing vaccination and regular health what we call checkups, especially in cut-off areas. In poor housing, cold weather increases the risk of what we call of pneumonia and other respiratory infections among the children of the Syrian refugees. We are also witnessing another important, stigmatization of children of Syrian, refugees, that is child labor and child what we call, soldiers. Many refugee children have to work to support their families, often in dangerous or what we call demeaning circumstances for little pay. Warring parties forcibly recruit children who serve as what we call fighters, human shields, and in support what we call roles, according to the US State Department's of Trafficking in Persons report, if you consult the latest what we call. We have also been witnessing child marriages. Syrian children are more vulnerable to sexual abuse and exploitation in the unfamiliar and overcrowded conditions found in the refugee camps and informal what we call tent settlements. This is a point which I have also pointed out, and I have very broadly I have written on this particular point. The refugee health in camps that has, I think, 2 years back, that has been published. My dear friends, without adequate income to support their families and fearful of their children, particularly their daughters being molested, parents opt to arrange a marriage for girls, some as young as 13 years of age. It's a very deplorable situation. We also come to know that there are a paucity of the education opportunities. About 40% of the Syrian refugee children are out of school. In Syria, war ultimately reversed 2 decades of the educational progress. 1/3 of the schools are not having classes because they have been damaged, destroyed, dismantled, or occupied by military groups or displaced people. And these buildings are being utilized as shelter homes for refugees or for internally displaced people. There have been certain important promises which have been made. There have been what we call an amalgamation of promises and pains. Thousands of migrants and refugees continue to arrive at Europe's border, but many are not going anywhere. The new barriers are in place, and deliberately I have presented an entire canvas of across the border treatment which is being meted out to Ukrainian refugees by the political leadership of the European nation states. And now you will understand what kind of laws, legislations, restrictions have been created and imposed by the same political leadership of European nation states in case of or in the context of the arrival of Syrian refugees. The new barriers have generated a new kind of a violence, and that is being flared up at the various EU member state borders. A hate mongering is being generated against Syrian refugees by the political establishment or by the far right outfits in European nation states. My dear friends, European Union is split over how to tackle the crisis before even more migrants arrive as the weather improves in each and every season. Syrians form the largest group by nationality, my dear friends, among the millions who have fled the country's civil war. Despite some progress, the European Commission said in a report, and that too, my dear friends, almost 5 years ago, that full implementation of the promised measures has been lacking. Therefore, what promises have been kept or broken, that must also be critically appreciated, and this is the responsibility of the political establishment of the European nation states. A major point of dispute, my dear friends, is the European Union's doubling regulation, as it states that the country where asylum seekers first arrive has a duty to process their applications and their contentions. Greece and Italy, for example, on the front line of the crisis in the Mediterranean, have been heavily criticized for allowing people to cross their territory unregistered. Most migrants want to reach Germany or other countries in the northern Europe. Greece is of the view that it is overwhelmed by the influx and demands that the burden be shared more equally among the European Union partners or the member states of the European Union. The European Commission, my dear friends, particularly the European Union executive, is revising the regulation, but it says migrants must be registered on the arrival in the European Union. The identification process has improved, and Commission figures suggest that increase the number whose fingerprints were included in a database raised from 10% in the September last year, and that is and from 10% to almost 80% in January, and that is this year. And in Italy, corresponding rise is also being witnessed. But progress has been very slow, my dear friends. European Commission is of the view that because of clearly because of the clear delay in setting up hotspot reception centers in the European Union external borders, the registration process carried out, and there has been no determination as per the standards which have been set by the European Commission. So far, the registration work, particularly the registration of the asylum seekers. No adequate mechanisms have been provided even regarding the relocation of these Syrian refugees. No mechanism has been in place how to ensure the return of these Syrian refugees to their country of nationality. This has also generated a lot of harakiri so far. European response to these Syrian refugees is concerned. However, the cooperation between Western Balkan countries on the migrants route north remains insufficient. And therefore, the European Commission says that the unilateral decisions such as border closure or restrictions have created a domino effect on the arrival of what we call refugees. The result is a de facto policy of refusal of entry by nationality or by intended country of registration of a request for asylum, and that is the what we call bone of contention, and that has become a vital point in the entire what we call advocacy on the part of the refugee advocacy of the refugee reception on the part of the European Commission. Another important example I can share at this stage is of Hungary. Hungary set off the European what we call dominoes last year by fencing off its southern borders. The crisis, my dear friends, therefore threatens the existence of the European Union cherished Schengen passport free travel zone and covering most of the Europe. I can also share at this stage the Human Rights Watch contentions that the Greece Macedonia border closure and Austria's controversial decision to impose a daily cap on asylum application showed European Union's utter failure to respond to this particular crisis. These kinds of tactics, my dear friends, are not at all there in case of Ukrainian refugees. In case of Syrian refugees, Macedonia, not yet an EU member, has been letting only a trickle of Syrian and Iraqi refugees through keeping other migrants what we call out. So we have been what we call witnessing some kind of a selective approach on the part of what we call of this Macedonia. So you can very well understand what kind of an attitude has been there so far Syrian refugees are concerned. I can share one of the most important what we call situation. In October 2015, my dear friends, EU countries approved a plan to relocate around 2 lakh asylum seekers across the bloc, despite strong opposition from Central and Eastern European nation states. The fundamental aim was to alleviate the pressure on Greece, Italy, and Hungary. But in December, Hungary and Slovakia filed a lawsuit against the quota plan at the European Court of Justice. But in case of Ukrainian refugees, my dear friends, no such steps are being undertaken by the governments of Slovakia. But in this particular count, again the progress has been very slow. The European Commission says only 220 migrants have been relocated from Greece out of a target of what we call of the 65 or the 60 what we call 7,000 refugees. In case of Italy, my dear friends, again almost 280 have been relocated to other European nation states, but the target has also been of around what we call 40,000. The relocation plan that has been designed affects refugees from Syria, Iraq, and Eritrea. I will also share with you, my dear friends, on this particular point, the potential refugee crisis which are likely to take place in this year, and that is 2022. And my dear friends, there are as many as more than a dozen potential refugee crises which we are going to witness this year, particularly after month of June in this year. I will let you know who are those very potential refugee crises. My dear friends, only 12 member states have received relocated people of Syrian, what we call refugees, and 5 countries are yet to offer places for the Syrian refugees. European Commission, my dear friends, originally called for mandatory what we call the relocation of the refugees across the European Union, and at the same time using a key based on country size and economic strength of a particular nation state. But the governments rejected that kind of a formula while saying that it could only be a voluntary scheme and there should not be a fixing of the quota system because it is going to be impractical. Therefore, the promises, whatever the promises have been made by the European nation states under the auspices of the European Commission, that has not been fulfilled to its what we call capacity or targets. Because the European Union return system has been harmed by the failure of the member states to deport swiftly those who have no legal right to say the Commission says. Last year, my dear friends, almost 4,000 migrants were returned in operation that has been coordinated by the Frontex, the European Border Agency. The figure does not include migrants, particularly those migrants who have been sent back without any kind of Frontex involvement. In Greece, there were almost 17,000 forced returns and 4,000 what we call assisted voluntary return of the economic migrants according to the European Commission. But the number still remains insufficient in the context of over 8 lakh arrivals in the subsequent years or before the 2018. This is the report of the European Commission. Therefore, identification again is the key to making the process work. So this has also created a lot of what we call burden on the working of the European Commission. So this has been the situation and the treatment on the part of the European nation states, my dear friends. Therefore, let me pose at this stage certain specific questions. What exactly have been the contemporary issues in international refugee law? This is the most vital question. Vital question in the sense, because it is important to understand the contours of issues, nature of issues, particularly in the contemporary canvas of international refugee law. What are the contemporary critical issues in international refugee law? What are the strategies towards an interpretative harmony for international refugee law provisions? Applications of human rights law to the interpretation of economic persecution. As my friend Mr. Om Jha has yesterday also raised this particular question, and this ultimately impelled my juridical proclivity that I must what we call make it a bone of contention in my submissions. We have to understand, my dear friend, the fragmented nature of international refugee regime and its consequences. How to have a comparative analysis of the application of the 1951 Convention. We must try to understand, my dear friends, therefore, the refugee issues like dynamics of mobility and displacement, women and children refugees, non-refoulement, to what extent it should be integrated as a preemptive norms of international law, and how to address, my dear friends, the loss and denial of the refugee status, particularly it has been, incorporated under Article 1F of 1951 Refugee Convention. That has to be taken into consideration. What are the two important, perspectives of the Syrian, conflict? Are these, Syrians justified in overwhelming the governments? Why or why not? What references to history can you make, my dear friends, based on this particular, conflict? Or what kind of, narrative we can generate on the basis of the historical reference in the context of the Ukrainian refugees? What if a group of people perceived, Donald Trump, the former, administration, and the current Joe Biden administration, and their governments as corrupt and threatening, and decided to attack? Is this justified, and why not? Why is it significant, my dear friends, to understand Syrian conflict, Palestinian conflict, Ukrainian what you call refugee crisis, or Russian what you call conflict, Rohingya what you call pogrom, or the Rohingya Holocaust? How we are going to address and how we are going to understand and conceptualize, and in other words, let me put it, how to address and how to what you call understand the conceptualizations of the contemporary global mass mobility as a crisis, and what does it mean to frame human migration with sensational what we call terminologies such as crisis? What could be the contours of this kind of a crisis, where, or let me put it like this, to what extent we can appreciate the economics, the political economy, and diplomatics, I should say, of refugee crisis out of these four crises. How these four crises, Rohingya refugee crisis, Syrian refugee crisis, Palestinian refugee crisis, Ukrainian refugee crisis, how these what we call crises are different, and what exactly are the commonalities in these what we call crises, and how the war has damaged Syria's, Ukraine's, Palestinians, and Rohingyas social and economic systems. So that has to be taken into consideration. And what does it mean to frame human migration with what we call sentimental, emotional, sensational terminologies? That should also be taken into considerations, because it is important, my dear friends, to ponder over how does language often associated with intractable what we call problems such as humanitarian or environmental disasters or political what we call stalemates shape the responses to rapidly expanding transnational human mobility? How to examine, my dear friends, the nature of the crisis, the implications of framing migration as a crisis, and the history and the present crisis frameworks, management what we call theories, and problem-solving mechanisms. How to address the problems of the employment of the crisis. Conceptualization is global in scope, but it is often applied regionally and nationally, such as the Australian response to refugee movements in the oceans north of the island nations, the Mexico-US border, the construction of what we call a wall during the Trump administration, and the Mediterranean and the Balkan overland routes into the European Union nation states. We have to take into account, my dear friends, the crisis language ushers in the hasty responses, stimulates a fraught political rhetoric, and resonates with the persistent and national, international, political, economic, social, cultural, and religious what we call tensions. But crisis language also mobilizes, my dear friends, diverse resources, generates, that also garners journalist and public attention, and instantiates emotional and moral and ethical what we call engagement. That must also be taken on into considerations while appreciating this kind of a crisis. And in this case, it is the crisis that has been generated by the Syrian government, Bashar Assad government, and who has been the backers of this kind of government. I will evaluate it and I will submit my further submissions on this line of argument on the next occasion. So thank you very much. If you have questions, you are most welcome.
Sir,
Yeah, please.
sir, actually, it's with regards to dissertation thing. Like, if you can send one sample of a dissertation copy to us, so sir, we can just see as to what corrections we can make.
Who is your supervisor?
Sir, my supervisor is Ramni ma'am.
Okay. So I'm fortunate enough.
Yes, sir, actually, my topic is with regards to like your your area of expertise only, like with regards to constitutional law and like right to information things. So, sir, I just wanted to like seek your guidance on this one.
You can ask anything under the sun. Don't worry. I will supply a model. Anything else?
No, sir, just wanted the model of one dissertation copy.
Obviously, I will share. I will share. Don't worry. Today itself, I will share. Don't worry.
Thank you so much, sir. Very grateful, sir.
Anytime.
Thank you so much, sir.
Anytime. So I hope everything is fine. So on Monday, I would be making my last submissions so far this semester is concerned. So Monday is going to be the last engagement in a formal sense. But at the same time, let me remind you, my dear friends, please, there is no conclusion of our engagement in higher education. As long as I am alive on this beautiful planet, I am ready to render my services voluntarily. I am there at your disposal. So don't worry, even if you leave this institution, you are most welcome. After passing out, even then I am ready to help you out if you demand anything under the sun. And that is within my reach. Inshallah, I would render each and everything. So thank you very much. See you on next occasion.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
A nice day, sir.
Stay blessed. Wish you all the best.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
You're welcome.